Living with Ashley was always an experience. She had a presence that couldn't be ignored, an energy that filled every corner of our apartment. She was the kind of person who could turn a dull Tuesday into an adventure, who made life feel lighter and less overwhelming just by being in the room. She laughed easily, teased effortlessly, and moved through the world like she owned it. But there was something else about her, something I didn't dare to name. It lingered in the way she tossed her hair over her shoulder, that cascade of golden waves catching the light like it was showing off. It was in her lazy half-smile that seemed crafted just for me, even when I told myself it wasn't. It was there in the way her presence lingered in a room long after she'd left, in the way my chest tightened whenever she walked in. I pretended not to notice. That morning started like so many others. I woke up late, the sun already streaming through my blinds, the weight of the day pressing down on me before I even got out of bed. I was tired, bone-deep, soul-weary tired, but I didn't have the luxury of giving in to it. My only solace was the hot water waiting for me in the shower, the brief escape it offered before the chaos of the day could catch up with me. I stumbled into the bathroom, still half asleep, and turned the shower on, letting the steam fill the room. The water was blissfully hot as it cascaded over me, washing away the lingering fog of sleep. For a few precious minutes, it was just me, the steady rhythm of water on tile, and the faint scent of Ashley's shampoo from the shelf nearby. And then the door opened. At first I thought I'd imagined it. The sound was so casual, so out of place in my little bubble of peace, that it didn't seem real. But then came her voice, light and teasing, cutting through the hiss of the water. "Hey, relax," Ashley said like it was the most natural thing in the world. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing as her words registered. "What are you?" I started, turning toward the frosted glass of the shower door. But before I could finish, the curtain slid open and there she was. Ashley stood there, completely unfazed, one hand on her hip and the other holding a towel. Her hair was pulled up into a messy bun, and she was already shedding her oversized t-shirt like we'd done this 1,000 times before. My brain short-circuited, caught between disbelief and the sudden, overwhelming awareness of her. "I'm in a rush," she said, stepping into the shower like it was no big deal. "Don't look. Don't look. Don't look." The words rattled in my head as I spun around, pressing myself against the cold tile in a desperate attempt to follow her instructions. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure she could hear it, my mind racing with questions I didn't dare ask. What was she doing? Why was she acting like this was normal? And most importantly, why wasn't I stopping her? The shower suddenly felt impossibly small. Every movement she made, every splash of water, every shift of her body seemed magnified. I could feel her presence behind me like a weight, a heat that was impossible to ignore. "You're awfully quiet," Ashley said after a moment, her tone playful, almost amused. I could hear the smirk in her voice, the one that always made my stomach flip. I clenched my hands into fists, pressing them against the tiles as if the coolness could calm the storm inside me. "This is not exactly normal," I managed to say, my voice strained. She laughed, the sound warm and familiar and maddeningly casual. "What's the big deal? It's not like we haven't seen each other in bikinis before. This is not the same," I shot back, trying to sound annoyed but failing miserably. My voice cracked slightly and I bit my lip, cursing myself for my lack of composure. "Relax," she said again, her voice softer this time. "I'll be out in a minute." But a minute felt like an eternity. The sound of water against her skin, the faint scent of her shampoo mixing with the steam, the way the air seemed heavier now. It was all too much. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to focus on anything else, but it was impossible. She was too close, too present, too Ashley. I didn't dare move, didn't dare turn around. But every fiber of my being was hyper-aware of her. I could feel the space between us, the invisible thread of tension that seemed to pull tighter with every passing second. My chest was tight, my breath shallow, and I knew deep down that this moment had already shifted something between us. The steam swirled around us, thick and oppressive, and I felt like I was drowning in the weight of everything I wasn't saying. The sound of her voice, the easy confidence in the way she moved, it all felt like a challenge, a test I wasn't sure I could pass. And as much as I tried to pretend otherwise, I knew one thing for certain. Ashley wasn't just another roommate. She never had been. "I'm in a rush." "Don't look," Ashley said, her tone so casual it was almost infuriating. Like this was normal, like this wasn't sending my mind spiraling. The steam from the shower seemed to thicken as she spoke, wrapping around us, making the air harder to breathe. My brain felt like it had short-circuited, every rational thought replaced by a deafening chorus of what is happening right now. I forced myself to turn around, pressing my palms flat against the cool tiles in front of me as if they could anchor me in this suddenly surreal moment. But even with my back turned, there was no escaping her. Ashley had always had a way of making her presence known, of taking up more space than her physical form required. Now, in the close confines of the shower, it was overwhelming. Every sense seemed heightened, every sound amplified. The soft splash of water as it hit her skin, the faint floral scent of her shampoo, the way her voice lingered in the humid air, it all felt too much too close to her. My heart was racing, a frantic rhythm that I was sure she could hear over the sound of the water. My face was burning, the kind of heat that had nothing to do with the steam. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to focus on anything else, but it was impossible. She was right there, inches away, and my mind couldn't help but run wild. "You're awfully quiet," she said, her voice laced with amusement. I flinched at the sound, my hands pressing harder against the tiles as if I could disappear into them. My throat felt tight, my words trapped somewhere between my chest and my mouth. What was I supposed to say? That this was the most ridiculous, most confusing, most intense thing that had ever happened to me? That I couldn't think straight with her this close? Her tone turned teasing, light but undeniably pointed. "What's wrong? Not used to sharing?" I took a shaky breath, trying to steady myself. "I'm just not used to this," I said finally, my voice quieter than I intended. I hoped it sounded neutral, but even I could hear the tremor beneath the words. "This?" she repeated, and I could hear the smirk in her voice. "What, a shower? Or is it me?" My fingers curled into fists against the tiles, my nails scraping lightly as I struggled to maintain my composure. She was doing this on purpose. I could feel it in the deliberate edge to her words, the way her presence seemed to fill every inch of the space we shared. "I didn't think you'd be so shy," she added, her voice softer now, almost curious. "I'm not shy," I shot back, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. My tone was sharper than I intended, a thin veneer of defiance covering the mess of emotions underneath. She hummed, clearly unconvinced. I could almost feel her grin without even looking. The tension between us was suffocating, the kind of tension that made the air feel thick and charged like the moments before a storm. I could feel my pulse thrumming in my neck, my cheeks still burning, and no amount of rationalizing could dull the acute awareness I had of her. Every small sound she made, every movement she took, it all seemed magnified, demanding my attention even as I fought to focus anywhere else. "I'll be quick," she said after a moment, her tone breezy again. But it didn't feel like a promise. It felt like a dare, like she was testing the limits of how far this could go, how much I could take. The truth was, I didn't know how much I could take. My thoughts were a tangled mess, caught between the need to hold on to the fragile boundaries of our friendship and the undeniable pull I felt whenever she was near. Ashley had always been bold, unafraid to push limits, but this felt like uncharted territory, like a line we were towing without fully realizing it. The minutes stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. I stayed frozen, my back still to her, but the sound of her moving behind me was enough to make my skin prickle. I could hear the water cascading over her, the soft rustle of her hands as she worked shampoo into her hair. My mind conjured images I tried desperately to banish, but they lingered anyway, vivid and impossible to ignore. "I don't get it," she said suddenly, her voice pulling me from my spiraling thoughts. "We've lived together for how long now? And this is what throws you off?" "It's not that," I said quickly, too quickly. "Then what is it?" she asked, and this time her voice wasn't teasing. It was softer, more searching, like she genuinely wanted an answer. I hesitated, my breath catching in my throat. What could I say? That I was completely overwhelmed? That every second she spent in this tiny, steam-filled space with me felt like it was rewiring something fundamental in my brain? That I was terrified she might notice the way my voice wavered, the way I couldn't quite keep my hands from trembling? "It's just different," I said finally, my voice barely audible. It was a weak answer, but it was the best I could manage. "Different how?" she pressed, her tone somewhere between curious and challenging. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My mind was too busy screaming at me to hold it together, to keep this moment from slipping into something I didn't know how to handle. But deep down I knew that line was already blurred. That something about this, about her, had already changed. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as we navigated the cramped space of the shower, the tension between us as palpable as the steam swirling in the air. Every movement felt exaggerated, every brush of skin or shift in position sending a jolt of awareness through me. I kept my back to her, my hands pressed against the cool tiles, but I could feel her presence, her energy, her undeniable closeness. It was suffocating in a way that had nothing to do with the heat of the water. I told myself to focus on the sound of the water splashing against the floor, the rhythmic patter that should have been soothing. But all I could think about was her, how her voice had carried over the rush of the water, how her laugh seemed to linger in the humid air, how her scent mixed with the steam in a way that made it impossible to ignore her. I was so lost in my thoughts that I didn't hear her at first. "Are you avoiding me?" she asked, her voice softer than usual, almost hesitant. The question cut through the fog in my mind and my hands stilled against the tiles. I wasn't sure if I'd heard her right. Ashley was never hesitant, never anything less than confident and in control. But there was something in her tone now, something that made my chest tighten. I turned slowly, the movement deliberate as if I were afraid that facing her would make the weight of the moment even heavier. When my gaze finally met hers, I felt a lump form in my throat. She wasn't smirking, wasn't teasing. Her expression was vulnerable. Caught me completely off guard. I started, but the words tangled in my throat. Her brow furrowed slightly and she tilted her head, studying me with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. "You are, aren't you?" she said, her voice quieter now, the hint of insecurity making her seem almost fragile. The idea that Ashley, effortless, self-assured Ashley, could feel insecure about anything made my heart ache. "I'm not," I said quickly, but the words came out too forcefully, too defensive. I sighed, lowering my gaze to the floor as I tried to find the right words. I don't know how to handle this." She took a step closer, the space between us shrinking until I could feel the warmth of her even through the haze of the steam. "Handle what?" she asked, her voice steady but gentle. "This," I said, gesturing vaguely around us. "Sharing a shower like it's no big deal." "It isn't a big deal," she said simply, but there was a softness in her tone that made me wonder if she believed that entirely. "It is to me," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. The vulnerability of saying those words out loud made my chest tighten, and I risked a glance at her, unsure of what her reaction would be. Her expression shifted then, the vulnerability in her eyes giving way to something else. Understanding, maybe, or recognition. She took another step closer and suddenly the small space felt even smaller. "Why?" she asked, and her voice was low now, the kind of tone that made my pulse race. I hesitated, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure she could hear it. I didn't know how to answer her. How could I explain the mess of emotions swirling inside me? The confusion, the fear, the undeniable pull I felt toward her. How could I tell her that every moment we spent together only made it harder to pretend I didn't feel something more? "I don't know," I said finally, the words escaping before I could stop them. It was a half-truth, but it was all I could manage. Ashley didn't respond right away. Instead, she studied me, her gaze soft but searching, as if she was trying to piece together the thoughts I couldn't say out loud. "I don't think that's true," she said eventually, her voice quiet but certain. The air between us felt charged, heavy with everything we weren't saying. I could see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, the way she was holding her breath like she was waiting for me to say something that would make sense of all this. But I couldn't. I didn't know how. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable," she said softly, and the sincerity in her voice made my chest ache. "But I need to know, is this just me? Or is there something here?" Her question hung in the air, suspended between us, and I felt like the walls of the shower were closing in around me. The truth was there just beneath the surface, but saying it felt impossible. And yet as I looked at her, her expression open, her vulnerability laid bare, I knew I couldn't lie. Not to her. Not to myself. "I don't know," I said again, but this time the words were heavier, filled with the weight of everything I was feeling but couldn't explain. "I think, maybe." Her lips curved into a faint, almost sad smile, and she nodded as if that was enough for now. But her gaze never wavered, holding mine with a steadiness that made my heart ache. "Maybe," she repeated softly, the word lingering between us like a promise or a challenge. And in that moment I realized that whatever this was, whatever we were stepping into, it wasn't something I could run from anymore. "It's not that," I replied, my voice faltering as the words left my lips. It's just complicated. The look in her eyes didn't waver. If anything, it sharpened like she could see right through me, peeling back the layers of everything I was too scared to admit. She took a step closer, slow and deliberate, her movements impossibly fluid. The space between us, already suffocatingly small, disappeared entirely. The heat of her, the nearness, was magnetic. It was as if she was the only solid thing in a world that suddenly felt unsteady. Complicated how? She asked, her voice soft but insistent. The question hung between us, heavier than the steam filling the air. Her gaze locked onto mine, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. I felt like I was standing on the edge of something vast and unknown, the ground crumbling beneath my feet. Her presence was overwhelming, her intensity pulling me closer even as every instinct screamed for distance. I don't know, I whispered, my voice barely audible. It wasn't a lie. I truly didn't know how to explain the chaos inside me. How could I put into words the way her every movement, her every look made my heart race? How could I admit that the lines between us were blurring in ways I couldn't ignore? Her expression softened, but her focus never shifted. I think you do, she said quietly, her tone gentle yet unrelenting. I swallowed hard, my throat dry despite the humid air. Her words struck something deep within me, the truth I'd been trying so hard to avoid. My hands clenched at my sides as I struggled to keep my composure, but her presence made it impossible to think clearly. Why do you have to push? I asked, my voice cracking slightly. It wasn't an accusation, it was a plea, raw and desperate. Ashley tilted her head, her lips twitching into a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Because I think you're afraid, she said simply. And because I think I scare you. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I flinched, unable to hide my reaction. Of course she scared me. Ashley, with her effortless confidence and her ability to draw people in without even trying, she was terrifying. She had a way of seeing right through my walls, of making me feel exposed in ways no one else ever had. But it wasn't just her confidence that scared me. It was the way she made me feel. How every glance, every touch sent my heart racing in a way that felt both exhilarating and impossible to control. It was the fear of what would happen if I let myself fall, if I let this moment spiral into something I couldn't take back. I'm not afraid, I said, but the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. Her smile widened slightly, her expression turning softer but no less intense. You're a terrible liar, she said, her voice tinged with amusement. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. The tension between us was too thick, the weight of her gaze too much to bear. She took another step closer, her movements slow as if giving me the chance to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. Tell me what you're afraid of, she said softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. My chest tightened, my thoughts spinning in a whirlwind of doubt and longing. I wanted to tell her, to say something that would make sense of the mess inside me. But when I looked into her eyes, so open, so vulnerable, I felt myself unraveling. I'm afraid of this, I admitted finally, my voice trembling. Of what this means. Of what happens if we cross that line. Ashley's gaze softened, and for the first time, I saw something flicker across her face that looked like relief. And what if it's worth it, she asked, her voice steady and sure. Her words sent a shiver through me, a spark that lit up every nerve in my body. My heart pounded in my chest as she took the final step, closing the distance between us completely. I could feel her now, the heat of her skin, the weight of her presence, the unspoken question in her eyes. Do you want this? She asked, her voice so quiet it was almost drowned out by the sound of the water. My breath caught, the weight of her question pressing down on me. I didn't answer right away. I couldn't. But as I looked at her, at the openness in her expression, the honesty in her gaze, something inside me shifted. Yes, I whispered finally, the word escaping before I could second-guess it. Her lips curved into a small, knowing smile, and she lifted a hand, her fingers brushing lightly against my arm. The touch was soft, almost hesitant, but it sent a jolt through me all the same. And in that moment, as the distance between us dissolved completely, I knew there was no going back. It was Ashley who broke the silence, her hand finding its way to my arm in a touch that was both gentle and deliberate. The warmth of her palm against my wet skin sent a ripple through me, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. If you don't want this, I'll stop. But I think you want this as much as I do. Her words echoed in my mind, bouncing off the walls of my racing thoughts. My brain felt like it had shut down, incapable of sorting through the storm of emotions swirling inside me. Fear, longing, uncertainty, and beneath it all, the undeniable pull toward her. He was right. I wanted this. I wanted her. Before I could think, before I could reason my way out of it, my body moved on its own. My hands found her face, my fingers threading through her damp hair, and then my lips were on hers. The kiss was urgent, almost desperate, like we had both been holding this back for far too long. The sound of the water hitting the tiles faded into the background, replaced by the heat and intensity of her kiss, the way her body leaned into mine like it was the most natural thing in the world. When we finally broke apart, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath, Ashley smiled at me, a soft, lazy smile that made my heart melt. "I guess that clears up a few things," she teased, her voice tinged with amusement but layered with something deeper, something almost tender. I couldn't help but laugh, though it came out shaky, unsteady, as if I was still catching up with the reality of what had just happened. "Yeah," I said, my voice barely audible over the rush of the water. "I guess it does." But Ashley wasn't done. Her hands found their way to my sides, her touch deliberate and unhurried as they skimmed over my skin. I felt my breath hitch, my body responding to her in ways that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. I was nervous, more than nervous, but I didn't stop her. I couldn't. She was everywhere, her presence filling the tiny space around us, and all I could do was let myself get lost in her. Her fingers trailed down my arm until they found my hand. She brought it to her lips, pressing a soft kiss to my knuckles before guiding it lower, her movements slow and deliberate. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst, and when she placed my hand against her body, her breath hitching as she looked at me with those intense, searching eyes, I thought I might explode. "Just don't stop," she whispered, her voice low and breathless. Her words were both a plea and a command, and they left me trembling with anticipation. I did as she asked, letting myself follow her lead, letting myself feel, letting myself fall. The rest of the world melted away. The ticking clock, the weight of everything that had been unspoken between us, the steam that blurred the edges of our surroundings. There was only her and the moment, and the overwhelming connection that left no room for doubt. When it was over and we were left standing under the now lukewarm water, everything felt different. The air between us wasn't heavy anymore. It was light, charged with a kind of intimacy that hadn't been there before. I didn't want to move, didn't want to break the spell, but Ashley was the first to pull away, her smile still lingering as she reached for a towel. "We're definitely late now," she said, her voice teasing but soft. I laughed again, a genuine laugh this time as I reached for my own towel. "Worth it," I muttered, earning a grin from her that made my heart skip. The apartment felt different after that. Smaller somehow, but not in a bad way. More connected. More ours. There were more casual touches, her hand brushing mine as we passed in the kitchen, her shoulder resting against mine on the couch. More shared looks that lingered a little too long, her gaze holding mine until one of us smiled and looked away. We didn't talk about it, not really. We didn't have to. Whatever had happened between us in that shower had shifted something fundamental, something that didn't need words to be understood. But the silence wasn't awkward. It was full, rich with unspoken meaning, and I found myself craving the quiet moments between us almost as much as I craved her. And then there were the times when we weren't quiet. The stolen moments when she would find me in the middle of a mundane chore, her hands slipping around my waist, her lips brushing against my neck. The times when I would wake up to find her sitting at the kitchen table, her hair messy and her smile impossibly soft, and I would lean down to kiss her just because I could. Every time I stepped into the shower after that, my heart raced a little faster, a thrill of anticipation running through me as I wondered if she would join me again. And every time she did, it felt just as electric, just as new as that first time. There was something irresistible about the way it had all started, the way she had turned my world upside down with nothing more than a casual comment and a knowing smile. And as much as it scared me, as much as it left me questioning what came next, I knew one thing for sure. I didn't want to go back to the way things were. Not now. Not ever.